For the last video of Chapter 10, let's put together all the different hypothesis tests we've learned. So the first thing we learned was in section 10.2. That's when you're trying to test a population proportion. So when you're reading the questions, you want to look for words like proportion, percentage. Those are going to be signs that it's a test for proportion. If that's the case, you're using a Z distribution, and the type of test it'll be will be a one-prop Z test in your calculator. So let me bring up the inferential statistics sheet so you can see it right in here. I tell you right up at the top, it's a one-prop Z test, and notice you're talking about a proportion here. So keep that in mind. If you're looking for proportions, that's what you're going to need. Here are the requirements, which sometimes we honestly skip a lot of that most of the time because we just assume we have them. Then you have to run your test with your P and as your parameter, not mu, not sigma, P. P for proportion. And remember that you use this one prop Z test to get a lot of things out of the calculator, such as Z0 or P hat, stuff like that. Always remember that 0 is your null hypothesis, your zero hypothesis, the thing you assume to be true unless you can prove it otherwise. If you're doing the p-value method, you'll follow along this path, using that same test statistic you found in part 3, and then the p-value, of course, comes out of the one prop Z test that you do with the calculator. If you're stuck doing the classical method, you're going to have to use either inverse norm or the bottom row of the t-table, and what we learned in chapter 7, which is when we first saw this, for finding critical values. Remember that inverse norm always takes the area in the left tail. That is always the way inverse norm is. The t-table always is talking about the area in the right tail. You can tell that because when you look at the top of the distribution on the t-table, see how it has the area in the right? And the bottom row of that table is some z-scores. But of course, there's only about 12 of them here. Any other z-scores you need for critical values, you'd have to get using inverse norm on the calculator. All right, so that's that one. Also, remember just real quick, majority means P is greater than 0.5 would be your alternative. Minority means less than 0.5. So these are possible alternative hypotheses. If you see the word majority somewhere, that's greater than 0.5. If you see less than, or see minority, that's less than 0.5. If you remember way back in 10.2, we had a question that used those words. Minority, as a matter of fact, was used. And because of that, we knew, there it was, minority, we knew that it was, our alternative hypothesis was less than 0.5 right here. You can also kind of tell you're working with proportions in this problem, not just because of the word minority, but because they're giving you 304 and 116, and that's about it. When you don't see standard deviations, you don't see data, you don't talk about the mean, any of that stuff, then it's usually a proportion. In general, if the question feels like it doesn't have enough given to you in it, if it's all words and very few numbers like this, that's usually a sign that it's a proportion problem. They can be amongst the hardest spot. Oh, and let me real quick remind you how to grab it in the calculator. So you go to Stat, you go to Tests. One prop Z test is number 5. Remember, you'll need X and N and a P0. P0 was your null hypothesis. Look, this is the same test we actually did back then. And then we had a minority, so we had a less than. Use your arrows to get down. Don't press enter. If you press enter, it'll automatically take that not equal to one you don't want, etc. Also remember that your X value when you're doing that has to be a whole number. If it's not a whole number, you might have to round to make it a whole number. You have to have a whole number right here for your X value. All right, so there's that one. Then let's see what else we got. Last page. All right, so what about testing the population mean? So, real quick, to test a population proportion P, we use P hat, our sample proportion. To test our mu, population mean, we'll use X bar, which is our sample mean. That'll be a t-test, and that, since it has the letter T right in there, is a sign that you're using the T distribution with n-1 degrees of freedom. So let me grab that page on the inferential statistics sheet so you can see it. So you'll notice your hypotheses all have mu's in them now. Your test statistic, instead of being Z0, is now T0. And instead of using Z's down here in the either approach, p-value or classical, you're using T values. So the p-value approach is pretty simple. You just use the same number you already found, and you get your p-value out of the calculator when you do that t-test right there. The classical approach you're going to have to use your either inverse t or the t-table. And again, inverse t always uses the left tail area, just like inverse norm does, whereas the t-table is always talking about the right tail area. Then you'll have to make your decisions based off of those numbers and reject or not reject, and then state your conclusion. And remember, we learned a very specific way to state our conclusions. Now let me just show you real quick the stats. So if I go to stat, go to tests, pick number 2, which is t-test, you have an option of data or statistics. Data is when you actually have a column of data that you've entered into L1 like this, right? Tests, hold on, stat, if you do it with stats, means that you have some valuable information like X bar and S given to you in the problem, and they never gave you a column of data. If that's the case, then you'll use stats and type in your values for X bar and S, and mu0 for that matter. Remember, mu0 will be your value from your null hypothesis. So it'll always be whatever number was from your null hypothesis. Your alternative is either not equal to, less than, or greater than. So when you look at the calculator, you have to go down here with your arrows and choose, is it a two-tailed test, a left-tailed test, or a right-tailed test? All right, so that's how to do t-test with the calculator. And the calculator will help you find the t0 value. It'll give you the p value. It'll give you x bar, s, and n. What it won't give you is your critical values directly. You'll have to find those with inverse t. Or you could use the t-table if it's a value that's in the t-table with degrees of freedom n-1, and you'll have to figure out the area in your right tail. Or your left tail and just make it negative, right? Because that graph is symmetric. All right, now your last kind of test is the chi-square test. So that's for population variance or standard deviation, in which case you'll use the sample variance and sample standard deviations to test them. And that uses the chi-square distribution, which is not in your calculator. So you'll have to do everything by hand unless I give you the computer output. So if you're doing the classical method, remember you will find your critical values with the chi-square distribution from the table. And I wrote that right here. Find your critical values chi-square. Also remember that it doesn't really matter if you use sigma squared or sigma as long as you write the numbers correctly. So obviously sigma squared should be squared. That's kind of a sign. And remember that the requirements for this test are a little bit different than they are for the other tests. This one requires normal distribution, whereas the test for a mean only requires normal or greater than 30. The test for proportion requires n times p times 1 minus p is greater than 10. So each one of them's got slightly different requirements in order to get away with running a hypothesis test. This one, remember, is not in the calculator, so you're going to have to do either this approach by hand, the classical method, using the chi-square table with n-1 degrees of freedom, or if I give you computer output somehow, then you can use that to figure out where your chi-square stat lands and what your p-values are, or p-value is, excuse me. All right, so those are the main types of tests. In general, what you want to look for are the keywords. So if it's talking about testing the variance, testing the standard deviation, then it's this test. If it's talking about the average, the mean, then that's this test. And if it doesn't seem to say a lot and seems to talk about percentages, and then that's usually this one, proportions. All right, we're all done with chapter 10. You have learned your first 3 hypothesis tests. Well, 4 if you want to count these 2 as different, although they're not really different from each other. They're basically the same thing. Now you're going to learn several more in chapter 11 and 12. But hopefully you've gotten a good foundation under your feet now for chapter 10. All right, I'll see you back here for chapter 12 and 11.